Hi, this is Amy from Good Food Unearthed, and welcome to part one of a very brief overview on human rights. So, this is going to be a series of short videos that give an introduction into human rights, what they are, why we have them, if there's any justification for violating human rights, what those could be. And then we're going to look into specifically for Canada and international covenants, medical law, informed consent, and so on. So, this information is a starting point to give you that basic overview to help you know your rights and be able to competently stand up for and defend your rights, which is every individual's right to do. So let's start with our first section here. And all right. So, human rights, and we're going to look at later on specifically how the COVID-19 measures, which are the lockdowns, social distancing, the mask mandates, the vaccination, if there's any mandates for working or for travel, um, or anything that will be coercive. And we're going to look at how what's happening now is setting the precedent for the invalidation of human rights in Canada and across the globe. And this is a pretty big thing that we're looking at. We're facing a future where your human rights are conditional and they can be thrown up in the air for whatever reason is provided without any demonstrable evidence. And even if you have an emergency, it's already been written about what needs to happen with regards to human rights. And we're going to go into that. We're looking at a reversal of any efforts that have happened in our history striving towards a more free, just, and peaceful human society overall. We're looking at the removal of free speech. We're looking at the removal of freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. And this is very critical. We're also looking at the reversal of freedom of movement, which is also extremely important. And we're going into a regression into dictatorial regimes. Now, what that means to be dictatorial is that one person says, you must do this, and you have to obey, or you will be punished. That is dictatorial. And it is by unelected experts, such as chief medical officers. We are going into a world where you yourself, the individual, will have no bodily autonomy. You no longer will have the right to protect your physical and psychological integrity because it will not belong to you anymore. It will belong to unelected experts. And no freedom of conscience or expression of opinion and other rights as well. So, this is the outline for this upcoming series of presentations. In part one, we're going to be talking about what are human rights? Why do we have them? Is there ever a good reason to violate them? That's part one. Part two is going to be specifically on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and constitutional law, what place that holds here in Canada. Then we're going to look at international declarations and covenants to which Canada is a signatory. And this is because these international declarations and covenants have to be taken into account with domestic laws here in Canada. And then we're going to look specifically at medical law and ethics and how with COVID 19, we have now made medical martial law the supreme law of Canada, overriding the constitutional law, overriding the Human Rights Acts, overriding disabilities acts and patients' rights, and so on. And then we're going to look finally at crimes against humanity and what it means to be human, and how the choice, what it ultimately comes down to, always belongs to you, the individual. So let's get started with our most basic foundation. What are human rights? So if you look up the IJRcenter.org, this is the International Justice Resource Center, human rights are defined as those activities, conditions, and freedoms that all human beings are entitled to enjoy by virtue of their humanity. They include civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Human rights are inherent, inalienable, interdependent, and indivisible, meaning they cannot be granted or taken away. So it is not your government that gives you rights, and it is not your government that can take away your rights. These are an intimate part of you. Your rights are you. They're inalienable, inseparable, and they are interdependent. So the enjoyment of one right affects the enjoyment of others, and they are indivisible, and that's why all of them must be respected. So, one document I want to touch on to give an overview is the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was put together after World War II. And the reason why I'm using this document is not because I support the United Nations, but because this is a statement, a declaration that is universally acknowledged around the world as putting together human rights that we all agree with. Okay, so in the preamble, I'm going to take apart some of these paragraphs because each one of them holds very valuable information, and you can take them on their own and they would stand up against, any challenge, logical challenge. So let's start with the first paragraph. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Just to start off with, we are recognizing that the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world is the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family without distinction. So, the opposite, if you don't have recognition for that, if you don't have the respect for and observance of these human rights and of the human dignity, then you don't have freedom, you don't have justice, and you don't have peace. We're going to look at later how the ends cannot justify the means if we're trying to say that, well, because such and such, we have to ignore our inalienable rights, and for this group or for that group. But it can't work like that. Now let's look at the next paragraph. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. So we know this. We know throughout our history that when we disregard and have contempt for human rights, when we make excuses and say, well, this is an emergency, or we have to put this aside for now. Yes, we need to put the Japanese in an internment camp and their whole families, even though they've grown up here in the US and there's no justification for it. Yes, we need to take away freedom of speech because we have some people who will act with violence and we're going to blame the language instead of the choice of action of the people themselves. We're making excuses, and those excuses are taking away our human rights. And that leads us down a very dangerous road. The second part of this paragraph says that the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So, our freedom of speech is not, yes, you can say this, but you can't say that. Yes, you can say this, but you need to reword it this way. Yes, you can say that, but you just can't say it here. Yes, you can say that, but no, right now you need to be silent. That's double speak. That is not freedom of speech. That is censorship. That is control. Freedom of belief is the freedom to have your own worldview, to form your own concepts about how the world is from your own experience and perception. Freedom from fear is being grossly violated with the intentional incitement of fear that is happening 24/7 with the media, with whatever they pull out: domestic terrorism, bioterrorism, case numbers, anything to incite fear and panic in people. And it's being used to gain compliance. It's being used to shift people in a certain direction. That's coercion. That's also known as soft power, the power of persuasion. And freedom from want. This is also covered in Article 1.2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which I'm going to talk about in the section on international covenants. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. What does that mean? Well, what do people need to live? They need clean air, clean food, clean water. They need adequate shelter. They need clothing if they need to be warm. They also need to be able to work in their jobs. We've had small businesses being closed and restrictions being put on them that make it impossible for them to meet their bottom line, to actually support their employees, to earn a living to support their families. So let's look at the third paragraph here. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And it finishes here in my section, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the UN, the promotion of universal respect for and observation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So, the duties of member states who have signed this declaration are to, one, respect human rights. That means that government that is in place, that is a restriction on them. They cannot violate those human rights. They have to respect them. And two, to protect those human rights. So laws that are created must align with respecting and protecting human rights. And as well, there must be provided effective means of recourse for individuals who have had their human rights violated. Now, if you are in Canada, you have in your province a Human Rights Commission, and you should be able to file human rights complaints for violations and claim damages as well. You can also make a civil case and go to small claims court, and that's something you can look into, and I'll show you some resources. So this statement that I'm showing you next is in the Declaration of Human Rights, and this is prior to any of the human rights being listed. This is a fundamental statement, so we're going to break it down. All human beings are born free. They are born equal in dignity. They are born equal in rights. So let's look at that first. And we're going to start with all human beings. And that means all of us, without distinction, no discrimination. So you cannot be discriminated against for your belief, your worldview, for your opinion, for your political stance, for your religion, for any race, any difference, any perceivable difference does not make you any less free or equal in dignity and rights. And this includes as well your medical choices and your medical status, your health status. Now let's define a few terms. What does it mean, free? Well, freedom or liberty is to not be controlled by the obligation or will of another. It sounds pretty simple, and we're going to go into that a bit more. Equal means the same in magnitude, quantity, degree, amount, worth, value, or excellence. There is nobody superior, there is nobody inferior. Our differences are superficial. We are all unique, that is true. But we are equal in the fact that we are all unique. We are equal in the fact that we share an existence together. We are equal in the fact that we should all give each other respect and regard for existing together. Dignity is the right of a person to be valued and respected for their own sake and to be treated ethically. And we're going to expand on that a little bit more. And rights. Rights are entitlements to perform or not perform certain actions, or to be in or not to be in certain states. And that's for yourself and that's for others. So now let's look at the second part of this. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Endowed is the same thing as being born with. You have it by chance or by birth. It means it is already in you. So all human beings are endowed with reason and conscience. You may not agree with somebody's reasoning. You may not agree with their views on what is right or wrong. But they have come to their views on what's right and wrong, and they have come to their own reasons because they have the faculties to do that. Reason is the power to think rationally and logically and to draw inferences. Conscience is an inner feeling or voice viewed as acting as a guide to the rightness or wrongness of one's behavior. Now, those two definitions, I'm also going to expand on them because it's important to understand what we mean when we're talking about reason and conscience, and not to get caught in the trap that these are 100% objective and that there is only one right way to see this, and that we need the idea, the concept that we need one way to see things so that we can peacefully coexist. That is really, in reality, a fallacy. We do not need to force the same view on everybody to peacefully coexist. Now, the last part of that paragraph, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I'm going to share with you towards the end of this how natural law, this is something that has been taken into account, and all other laws are subservient to this. We have our human laws that we create in our societies that people agree upon to test out and see that they work and form a free society that people can function in, that they all have mutual benefit from. But beyond that, we exist in this universe, in this cosmos, and there are natural laws that exist whether or not our laws are in place. And to act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, what I'm going to touch on is how all the religions, all of the cultures, all around the world have noticed some very simple natural laws, like the maxim of reciprocity, the term of what goes around comes around. So we're going to touch on that. So you are born free. Well, what does this mean? Have you ever asked yourself, what does it mean to be free? Do you know what are the conditions that bind you? And where does your freedom exist? Well, to be born free is in a way to not be bound to service, to not be a slave of anyone or anything, including systems like governments. You can be born into a society, but you still have free will. You can be exposed to a certain system, but you still have free will and a conscience that allows you to change things, that allows you to create other avenues. To be free is to not be controlled by the obligation or will of another. That is your autonomy. And it is your choice to be autonomous. You can choose not to be. You can choose to follow someone else. There is always that free will that exists. But ultimately, to be free, if somebody else wants you to do something, you always have the choice. Do I choose to follow that person and oblige them? Or do I choose not to? When we talk about sovereignty and individual sovereignty, this is when you yourself are your own master. This is when you are conscious enough to know how you yourself respond, how you yourself behave. You've come to know how you think, how you feel, what things trigger you, how you are choosing to interact with your experience. You've compiled information and you've decided how you want to respond, and you're conscious of your responses. You don't just react. And that's when you get individual sovereignty and you take full responsibility for what happens in your life, for how you choose to experience your life. This is recognizing that you alone are the only one who experiences your life, no one else. And this will not change from birth until death. You alone make your choices, even if your options appear limited from other factors. As Viktor Frankl wrote about his experience in the camps during the Holocaust, even if everything else in your life has been taken from you and your every moment is controlled, you still have the choice of how you are going to experience that. You choose how your mindset will be. You choose how you're going to feel. You choose your art of living. You alone are the only one who is aware of the choices that you perceive at any given moment. Who is to say to you that what you did in a moment was wrong if they don't know the choices you perceived at that time? But you will know, and natural law will also take it into account and give you feedback. So, with all of this in mind, it's important to recognize that in spite of how things manifest in your reality, you always have free will. In every single moment, you always have free will. In a book called The Politics of Obedience, Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, which was written around 1548 or thereabouts, it's an excellent book to read. Etienne de la Boete says, "It is incredible how as soon as a people becomes subject, it promptly falls into such complete forgetfulness of its freedom that it can hardly be roused to the point of regaining it, obeying so easily and willingly that one is led to say that this people has not so much lost its liberty as won its enslavement. If there is always free will in every moment, you can choose whether you follow a tyrant or whether you don't. And how that manifests will be unique to your situation, but you have the choice." And another thing that will come up, and we'll touch on this with natural law, is what follows in this quote: "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." See, to free yourself first, you have to know yourself and you have to act in a way that encourages freedom to be expressed through you. And when you do that, it just naturally happens that you respect and enhance the freedom of others. When you yourself have bound yourself, when you are not free, when you create conditions and chains, then you also don't respect or enhance freedom in others. There is no separation here between self and other, and this is another truth of reality. Yes, we are each unique manifestations of this existence, but we are also at the core, one. And so for me to be free, I can only be free if you are free. And if you are not free, I am not free. If I am not free, you are not free. All human beings are equal, they're born equal in dignity. So let's look at that. Dignity is the right of a person to be valued and respected for their own sake and to be treated ethically. So, what does that mean to be valued and respected for your own sake? This is basically to be valued and respected simply because you exist just as you are. No distinctions. This would be the same as saying you respect all of life, everything that you experience. And again, it starts with you. If you value and respect yourself, all that you are, then how can you not value and respect everything that you experience because it's experienced through you? So you value and respect the space that you live in. You value and respect all of the sentient beings that come to interact with you in your space. You value and respect every human being, no matter what they look like, no matter what their beliefs are. Even if you disagree with them, even if you do not condone their actions, you still see that they are living beings and there's a reason for them here. Ethics, to be treated ethically. So, this is to be treated in a way that you see, this is determined through your reason and conscience, you see as right conduct and character. This is the doctrine of man's duty in respect to himself and the rights of others. So, ethically, ethics would be when you do have that, you've built up that value and respect for yourself, for your own sake, simply because you exist just as you are. And that will then be reflected in your reactions, your responses to others. That is your ethics. You are endowed with reason and conscience. What does that mean? Well, reason, we said, was the power to think rationally and logically and to draw inferences. Rational is defined as consistent with or based on good judgment, logical or sensible. Logical is based on earlier or otherwise known statements, events, or conditions. An inference is the act or process of deriving logical conclusions from premises known or assumed to be true. Now, if I were to just say that one definition for reason, you would come up with assumed ideas, concepts about what it is to be rational and logical and draw inferences. And it may be that those terms give you an inner sense of grounding, an inner sense of this is something that I can hold on to, that is solid, that is not really going to change very much, and it seems to make sense. And why does it make sense? Why does it seem logical? Well, because it's based on earlier or otherwise known statements, events, or conditions. So, what is that? That's just based on bits of data that you've been exposed to through your experience of living. And what you do when you reason is you take all of that information that has come across you in your life, and that information coalesces and works itself out, and you go through a process of saying, well, if this is true and now I have this new bit of information, does that mean when I put them together, what is still true and then what goes away? What is what still remains as a overall truth that hasn't really changed much, and what turns out to have been more of a conditional truth that may have been true for that point in time but isn't true for what's going on right now. And you work out that happening. Now, if you're conscious of that process, you can see yourself going through that, and you can actually see and continue to question and look at any of your assumptions. Look at any of that earlier or otherwise known bits of information and see if there's anything yet to question there. If you're not conscious of that, you still go through that process, but you may be missing some gaps. You may be jumping to some conclusions, but you're still reasoning. Conscience, you can divide into two as con and science. Now, science is what we do every single day in every moment. It is observation, it is the gathering of data through all of our senses, through our thoughts, through our emotions, all of this coming together. And that observation and experience has us reasoning, which has us forming theories, and then has us experiment, which is our manifestation of expression through our speech or our actions. And then there is a feedback we get from our environment, from our bodies, that feedback of personal experience. And that loop is something that goes on all the time. And from that, we form our beliefs, our worldviews, which are an acceptance that a statement is true, that something we've reasoned through is true, or that something exists. It is also trust, faith, or confidence in someone or something. And again, these aren't baseless. They come out through our reasoning, our reason with our science, with our process of observation, theory, experimentation, and feedback. These two are intimately connected, reason and conscience. Each person will have that unique experience of life through their own perception, and that makes it highly subjective. The things that we have sort of objectivity for are things that we can discover through reasoning and through our observation and theory and experimentation. When we come across bits of data that seem to pervade, that seem to remain when all the other bits of data will change and shift. So we have conditional, what are sometimes called conditional truths, and then you have absolute truths. And the absolute truths tend to be things that are a bit more general, grounding, but they are also not absolutely fixed. They just happen to have a stability at this point in time. One important thing to realize is that anything is reasonable to someone. You just have to find out what their basic premises are. So if you study animals, you know this, where they think and have different perceptions than human beings, and it's a bit more obvious than human to human. But you can see that there are reasons for why animals do something. If you assume that an animal is unreasonable, then you won't be able to understand why they act the way they do, and you'll miss out on that information. And it's the same with a person. And there's no way to assume that a person next to you thinks and feels exactly the same way that you do, even if you share the same experience. The person will choose an action that you may see as unreasonable. But this is where communication, effective communication, comes into play, which requires effective listening. That's open receptivity to find out what the basic premises are for a person to choose to act in a way that at first you may see as unreasonable. But if you think, there's a reason to this, I just don't know it yet, then you will find the answer. Now, scientism, this is something that is an ideology. It's a belief that's not really based on science, but it's a belief on a certain type of dogma or paradigm that goes under the name of science that persist. And it is a religion that many people have adopted somewhat unwittingly today. And it's the belief that scientists or experts know best and you cannot question them and you should obey because they know what's good for you and you just need to do as they say. There's no actually taking personal accountability to look at the evidence yourself and use your own faculties to reason and use your own conscience. And that's where we have this divide. So, scientism is a religion. And despite what it will have you believe, no two human beings are the same. Their beliefs, their worldviews, they're not exactly the same. And therefore, no two human beings sharing a similar experience will have the exact same perception of that experience. Force, and this is where we get the violations of human rights coming into play. This is any method that attempts to repress the inherent dignity, liberty, and the rights that stem from that dignity and liberty of another. And in that attempt, there is the claim that one's worldview, one's belief, one's religion, one's concepts supersede that of another. This is with an inherent belief that some human beings are superior and some are inferior, that one has more rights than the other for whatever reason, because one is believed to be more intellectual, one is believed to be the dominant species, one is believed to be a keystone species. And this in itself is an inherent lack of regard for the dignity, freedom, and rights of the other. This quote I read today, and I think it's perfect. It sums up very well what I was just talking about. And this was from a book that was written as a portrait of Stalinist Russia and the freedoms that were taken away from the people during that time. Vasily Grossman wrote that everything that lives is unique. It is unimaginable that two people or two briar roses should be identical. If you attempt to erase the peculiarities and individuality of life by violence, then life itself must suffocate. And one important thing to recognize is that you cannot erase those peculiarities and individuality. You can maybe try to on the surface level, but it's a fallacy. All it results in is another person choosing to repress parts of themselves so that they will conform to somebody else's ideas about what is good, what is beneficial, and what is bad, and what should be gotten rid of. I love this quote that I found from an elder in Judaism. And it goes, "Why was only a single specimen of man created first? To teach us that he who destroys a single soul destroys a whole world, and that he who saves a single soul saves a whole world. Each one of us is a microcosm, and yet we are all part of one existence at the same time." In Buddhism, they talk about how when you destroy another, you are destroying yourself. There is no separation. And we're going to look at this with other religions and the golden rule. And this goes into natural law. Furthermore, it says, so no race or class may claim a nobler ancestry. And this here is talking about any distinction, any superficial distinction that humanity comes up with. You cannot say, well, our father was born first. And finally, to give testimony to the greatness of the Lord, who caused the wonderful diversity of mankind to emanate from one type. And just think about how beautiful that is, that no one is exactly like you. That's why you're here. If somebody was exactly like you wouldn't have to be here. Everything has a role to play in nature, and we know this when we study ecosystems. And you remove one component of that ecosystem, and it changes it. It's never the same. And why was Adam created last of all beings? And this is lovely. To teach him humility, for if he be overbearing, let him remember that the little fly preceded him in the order of creation. And this is again to have in natural law a regard for everything in existence. Human beings are not a superior species. We are not better than anything else. We are simply different. And when we recognize that we are not better and we are not inferior, there is no superior or inferior. We are just different. When we recognize that, we open up to seeing what is really going on. We open up to being able to understand how the world functions, how other species function, what is our part within this entire ecosystem. So, natural law is pretty much the observance that so many people have had about experience in general, and it's what our written documents on human rights stem from. Natural law exist in our shared reality as that feedback mechanism, those universal truths, such as they state in the Declaration from the United States, the Declaration of Independence, those universal truths which we hold to be self evident. In Christianity, they state this golden rule: in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. And this goes back to what I said with that respect for yourself, that value and respect for yourself simply because you exist just as you are right now. When you feel that, when you do that, when you act on that for yourself, then you automatically will have that same value and respect for others. So, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. This is you doing that to yourself first. This is what Gandhi said: be the change you wish to see in the world. If you wish to see people behaving in a certain way, you must behave that way. Because you are not seeing it and you are getting that feedback, why am I not seeing people doing this? That is your sign to say, because you are being called to do that. It starts with you. It does not start with trying to force anybody else to do it or to have somebody else wait until somebody else does it for you. It doesn't work like that. You alone are the change. Confucius said, what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. And again, if you experience pain and suffering from something in your life, you would not then, if to learn from it, to learn from that, you would not allow that to happen to you again, and you would not perpetrate that on anybody else. This golden rule, it appears in Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and the rest of the world's major religions. It goes back to ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient India. And in 1993, there were 143 leaders of the world's major faiths who endorsed the Golden Rule as part of a declaration toward a global ethic. You do not need to subscribe to a religion to see how the world works. You do not need to subscribe to a religion to treat yourself with value and respect, and to treat others with value and respect. Again, your human rights are inherent. You are born free. You are endowed with reason and conscience. It is you. It cannot be separated from you. It's inalienable. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So why do we have human rights? If we have natural law, why do we have these declarations of human rights? Well, history repeats itself. And we do have natural law. And because of that, we have viewed from our past methods, our past actions as humanity. They have demonstrated that when we react with force, that begets force. When we react with hatred, it begets hatred. And if we continue down that path, we see that it just repeats and leads to degradation, to destruction, destructuring. So things like the US Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, All of these written documents are simply reminders to us individuals of our humanity and our aspirations for ourselves. We know that we can live this way. These are reminders of the lines not to cross unless we want those negative actions to come back around. These are reminders to governments, to those who find themselves in positions of influence and power, of exactly where their duties end. In a free society, a government is not dictatorial by definition and cannot be above one single individual. There can be no exceptions. Do we have any governments like that in existence today? And if not, why not? This is something we need to ask ourselves. We are intimately a part of how we interact, how we form our societies, how it affects our lives. If we believe and we allow for some people to have more rights than others, then is that the existence we want to perpetuate? We have had much in our history of persecutions, of violent deaths, of torture, of cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment and punishment. Some examples were the persecutions of Christians went from the stories of Jesus in the Bible, and the witch trials when women were burned at the stake, or they were tortured, or they were drowned, when we had the Spanish Inquisition to try to convert pagans. And there was the thought that if you didn't convert them, they would burn in hell forever. So you had every right to do everything possible to try to convert them. And the horrific acts that were perpetrated on people is saddening. Now, these religious persecutions, it's not just tied to one religion. And again, it's not the religion itself, it's the individuals who will adopt the religion as an excuse. It becomes the excuse for a method of repression of the human rights of another. That's the same with race. That's the same with what happened when places were colonized and you had the people who were originally there labeled as natives or Indians or barbarians or uncivilized. Nationalities, different nations, different genders, different cultures. Nothing is inherently wrong with a race or a label on a people, but it can always be adopted and used as a mental excuse, as a blindfold to excuse methods of repression that are committed by individuals. It's important to note that no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their background or their religion. Try to remember what you were like when you were a child, before you were told what to think and what to believe. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. In Buddhism, they say that every single person is a Buddha. You just have to choose to remember it if you want to. What we are seeing now, when I talked about the beginning, we are seeing a regression. We are going back in time, and we are on the cusp of creating a segregated society, a society where people have passbooks, such as those they had in South Africa during apartheid, that will allow you to be in a place, to take transportation. You'll need a passbook because you are no longer valued and respected simply because you exist just as you are. We're going to see separate facilities where if you don't get vaccinated, you can't go here, but maybe you could go here. If you don't wear a mask, you can't have service here. You'll have to have it over here. And people will say, well, there's justification for this. It's a good reason. It's an emergency. Is there? Is it? If you have within yourself a belief that the ends justify the means, that you can violate the human rights of an individual, you better be darn sure that you have all of your evidence lined up and that your alternatives, your accommodations for people who can't fall into the categories you want them to fall into is not dehumanizing, does not take away their freedom and their human rights. And you better understand what those mean unless you want to repeat history. And just for some background information on the use of masks, if you don't know the science of this, I would ask you to look into it. You can take that personal accountability upon yourself. Look into it without prejudice and look into it exhaustively. Masks have been used for centuries as tools of silence and degradation. And do you think now is any different? Yes, they have been used that way. And they've been used as psychological torture tactics in a method called sensory deprivation in places like Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp and in Abu Ghraib. And why were they used? They were used to force compliance. We have had history, and it's not that long ago, but it does span back a long way, of medical experiments, testing the limits of the human body unethically, searching for more effective torture tactics to gain compliance. Again, it's methods to repress the human rights of another. There's been physical and psychological experimentation, and this is why the Nuremberg trials happened after World War II. But it never ended there. There have been medical experiments without fully informed consent still happening. Propaganda is not informed consent. And in reality, you as an individual cannot depend on anybody else to provide you with the information. It's been said before that those who would rather you obey them will not give you the information that would grant you your freedom. You're going to have to find it out for yourself. Just know that it is there, it is available, and you can guide yourself to it. We are going through medical experiments right now with the mask mandates, with social distancing, with the lockdowns, with the vaccine that is rolling out. That's an mRNA vaccine and technically should not be called a vaccine, although vaccines themselves are questionable and have a definition as biologics to get around certain regulations. So, if you really want to be the free, then you have to take the driver's seat in your life. You have to take personal accountability. You have to look into things that matter to you. And if you choose not to do that, you have to recognize that that is your choice and you are willing to take accountability for whatever happens as a result of that. That is what individual sovereignty is about. Now, as soon as one dehumanizes another, like we see with the immunization cards and the masking, no mask, no service, and no vaccination, no flying, again, no vax, no service, no vax, no job. As soon as one dehumanizes another, this, without exception, incites discrimination. It incites in individuals the sense of righteous indignation. I'll go back again to the Spanish Inquisition and the witch trials, where people were so certain that the pagans were evil, they were demons, they were devils. They needed to be converted to save their souls, or they would burn forever in hell. And therefore, they had every right to be indignant. They had every right to be angry at them, to perpetrate acts of hatred and judgment and shaming and ostracizing and violence and torture and cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. They felt that they were justified in their actions. They felt that they were doing what was right. But when you employ hatred, when you employ violence, when you employ toughness, what you get back is the same. And Martin Luther King knew this, as did Gandhi, as did others who talk about ahimsa or nonviolence and the power of love. He said that we must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Hate cannot get rid of hate. Intolerance cannot get rid of intolerance. If you say, I am usually a tolerant person, but I am intolerant of racism, what have you done there? You have made an oversimplification, past judgment, and now certain words you will hear will trigger you to shut down your brain and your receptivity to the individual who you are communicating with, and you no longer see them as a person. You have labeled them, you have categorized them, you have dehumanized them and set them to the side. Now we're going to look at love, because a lot of people think it's wishy-washy and that you turn the other cheek and let people walk all over you, but that is not the case. And you can say, no, I don't condone your behavior, but that doesn't mean that I hate you. It does not mean that I am intolerant of you. Because if you choose to do what you will do, you will choose to do what you will do, but you must recognize that I will make my own choices as well. I just choose not to act in hatred. I choose not to act in violence. I choose not to force my views on you. A regard for human rights is inherently not fear based. When we repress others, when we repress ourselves, there is not full acceptance for what is there. And therefore, there is a lack of understanding about what is there. And it just makes things fester and get worse. It doesn't allow you to see parts of yourself that maybe I don't wish to express them right now, but I can recognize them so I know when they're there and I know why they're there. And I know how to respond in a way that I feel is beneficial. But if you just push it away and you don't look at it and you don't get to know it, it will fester, it will get worse. And you will continue to react every time you are triggered. And that repression is a fear of looking at the parts of you that you may not like. But that means you never deal with them effectively. And therefore, you don't have that value and respect for yourself as you are right now. And you will reflect that in your actions with others. But if you have a regard for human rights, it may look something like this, where you, for another you say, you may not be like me. You may see the world differently. You may have had different experiences, and you may process thoughts and emotions differently. But I recognize that everything in life has a purpose. I am not the judge, jury, and executioner for your life. And on top of that, I believe that we both can learn to coexist in a manner that's mutually beneficial. Now, you may not agree with me and you may not believe that, but that doesn't matter because that is how I will choose to act, to learn to coexist in a manner that's mutually beneficial. Now, is there ever a good reason to violate human rights? Some people would say yes. They would say, well, an emergency is justified. Or what if somebody else has violated human rights? Then you have to take away their human rights. Well, let's dig into that a little bit. We'll go back to this statement here first from the International Justice Resource Center that talks about human rights and protecting them. And it states in the last paragraph that they cannot be granted or taken away. The enjoyment of one right affects the enjoyment of others, and they must all be respected. Nelson Mandela himself has said, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. And when we go back to this statement here, remember that your rights are a part of you. They are you. They're inherent. They're inalienable. Your human rights are part of what make you human. So to deny your human rights is to challenge your very humanity. So what about punishment for human rights violations? Well, we looked at the idea of natural law and then how our laws that we create for our societies try to work along with natural law. They're subservient to it. And we do create in each society different ways of dealing with violations of human rights. But if you really respect and value them, then you must still have regard and respect for the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of the person who was an offender. Now, their choices may become limited as a response, but they always have free will, like I stated in the beginning. That liberty is there. You are born free. That doesn't go away. On top of that, when we go into the rights, and we're going to look at these later when we look at the Charter and we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on, the rights that are listed include such things as no slavery or servitude, no torture or cruel, degrading, inhumane treatment or punishment, no discrimination, which is dehumanization, making out your differences, your superficial differences, to make you to be inferior to me. And every person has the right to life, has the right to liberty, which is again their free will to make that choice, which is already inherent within them. It cannot ever be taken away. When you understand what that means, you know that that's an impossibility. And they also have the right of the security of person, which is their autonomy physically and psychologically. This means they have autonomy over their health choices, they have health freedom, they have medical freedom, they have the right of protecting their physical and psychological integrity. And this has been covered in a case here in Canada specifically with the security of the person. This means your bodily autonomy, your psychological autonomy. This means that nobody can force you with a medical mandate. Nobody can force you to wear a mask, just as nobody can force you to wear a burqa or to not wear a burqa. Nobody can force you to take a vaccine. Nobody can force you to take a medical test. Nobody can force you to undergo a surgery. And we're going to look at that, especially when we get into medical law and informed consent. As I stated before, the end cannot justify the means for the simple and obvious reason that the means employed determine the nature of the ends produced. This is the same thing that was stated with Gandhi, with the eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and with Martin Luther King Jr., that hate begets hate. And we know this with science as well, where if you try to force something, you get an equal and opposite reaction, right? You get that battling together, you get friction. And we know this from the golden rule as well, where if you want to see something in the world, you have to become that yourself first. And this quote here from Nelson Mandela to end this off: I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. Now, whatever you think of Nelson Mandela, whatever history comes out, what matters is what you can glean from these statements. And it is true, as we talked about, if you oppress yourself, you oppress others. It is reflected in your actions towards others. So an oppressor is not somebody who is free. They have not freed themselves. And so if you try to take away someone else's freedom, See, that's an attempt to override someone else's free will. You don't respect freedom, and therefore you don't respect it for yourself either. What you do respect is force. What you do believe in is force and not freedom. But reality will show that free will exists, even if you try to force. You cannot get rid of it. You may try to control people's perceptions, to shift them in directions so that their free will choices will go in a way that you desire, but it is still their choices that can never be taken away. In Buddhism, when we talk about conflict and interactions with others and difficulties, the challenges in life are seen as the pressure and friction that are necessary to create a diamond. So, when I mentioned before that it is stated that each one of us is already a Buddha, things will come up to us, and it anything that you would call your enemy is actually a gift because it's a challenge. It is coming to you so that you may ultimately free yourself. It is so that you can excoriate the elusive chains and reveal your inner Buddha nature. If you have another religion and belief in God, God, if you logically follow it through, is absolutely everything. Even you. There can be no divide. Yes, you are a unique expression of God, but you are still part of God, part of the whole, part of all that is. If you can awaken to this, you can do this through the art of living your everyday life. Recognize God in everything. Even you. You're not separate. And unconditional love is not caving into pressure. That would imply no love or respect for self. If you love and respect yourself, you stand in your own, and that pressure or friction or challenge that comes to you will have you rise to the occasion. Because if you have fear, you will shrink back. But if you have love, you are not afraid of challenge. You are not afraid of friction. The strongest force in the universe is love, and it will manifest in many ways. It's not an emotion, it's not a fleeting fancy. It's all pervasive, and it's the connecting force in everything. It's a nurturing force that is that force of growth and evolution. The opposite. So if you think of life and the opposite, take that word and reverse it, it looks like evil, but really it's just the reverse of life. So what is that? It's the decomposition of things that have composed. Love would be that pervasive non-polarity expression of everything and nothing. So that is the end of part one on human rights and why we have them, what they are. Now, I didn't list all of the human rights in here because we're going to go through the human rights violations when we go through the charter and through the international covenants. So we'll cover them there. But the most important statement is that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards each other in a spirit of brotherhood, in recognition that we are all together. And what's going on now is there are people awakening to the fact that their actions intimately affect everything around them, but they are fearful because they do not fully see the truth of the nature of things, of how things play out. So they're reacting in fear and they're trying to superimpose their beliefs on all those around them. One thing I will finish off with is a quote from a text in Buddhism called the Bodhisattva's Guide, or the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And it states that, where would I find enough rubber to cover the whole world so that when I walk, I will not hurt my feet on stones? Why not instead have enough rubber just to put on my own feet? And therefore, again, we go back to Gandhi's be the change you wish to see. If you wish to wear a mask, if you wish to vaccinate, you can do that. That is your free will choice. But if you respect human rights and freedom, you will not force that onto another person. And if the mask were effective, and if the vaccine were effective, then you taking it would be protected. And ultimately, it is up to you taking responsibility for your own life to choose to investigate and look into all of the information that you can to make an informed choice, if that is your desire. If you choose to be a follower and to just do as someone says, that again is your choice, but you cannot force that way of life, that view of you must obey this expert on someone else who does not share that view. And if you believe that there is a deadly pathogen, think about practically, logically, what are actions that you yourself can take that do not violate the inherent inalienable human rights of your brothers and sisters. Be conscious of this. Do you want to live in a world that is free, just, and peaceful? Or are you trying to make the ends justify the means, and therefore are going down the path of repeating history? So thank you for taking part 1 on human rights, and part 2 will be looking specifically at the Canadian Charter and constitutional law here in Canada.